So, well, thank you very much for coming, Professor Rainsborough. It's a pleasure for us. We are Marco Berrocchio and Javier Alachea from the member series Military Strategy and Intelligence of the ITSS Verona. And again, thank you very much for coming. Today we have you here to interview you about in relation to the Book of Five Rings, an article, a topic we've written, an article about Mark and I before the last month. And as we know, you're an expert in this area. We just wanted to ask you some questions and so on, and to chat a bit, and see what comes out from this little talk. So the first question, and I think it's a necessary question, is to present yourself, because we ourselves, we know you, we've researched on you first of all, but also we know you as where you come from and so on. But like, we want the people outside there, our viewers, to know who you are and so on, right? So if you can, go ahead.
Well, thank you very much, and thank you for inviting me to participate in this talk. And I've had very good interaction with the ITSS in Verona up until now, so it's very nice to be invited to participate once again. Just before I begin, would you like the short or the long version of who I am?
What do you feel like? Just go for whatever.
Well, let's go for it. So yeah, so my name is Michael Rainsborough. I am British. I come from London. I'm the child of Londoners, although I spent most of my early childhood in Australia. So I have an Australian background, and that meant that as a child, certainly well, before the age of 10, I had actually been sort of pretty well travelled around the world, because my parents sort of came to and from Britain quite a number of times, and so I was able to sort of see the world quite extensively at a very early age, which was obviously a great privilege to be in that position. And I think that's perhaps was very formative in making me sort of very interested in the sort of current sort of topics that we're about to talk about. So thereafter, we moved back to the UK in the early 1970s, and obviously I did my schooling there, and I went on to university, and I did a first degree in international politics and strategic studies at the University of Wales in Aberystwyth. And I decided to sort of try to continue with my studies. I wouldn't necessarily say I was a particularly stellar student, but I tried hard. And I think the process of trying and studying hard eventually led me to understand that I was actually quite good at something rather than not very good at anything at all, as I thought I might have been up until that point. And so I went on to King's College, and I did an MA in war studies there, and that led on to a PhD, which I did under the supervision of Professor Lawrence Friedman, who I think you've interviewed before, which is very good. And I did my PhD on essentially the strategic thinking of the Irish Republican movement. And thereafter, I got my first job at the National University of Singapore, where I lectured in the Department of History. I spent about 3 years there. Then I worked came back to the UK. I spent a couple of years working for the Ministry of Defence in a teaching role at the Royal Naval College in Greenwich. Then I went back to King's College under a contract which took me, which enabled me to be based partly in London, but also partly in the other university in Singapore, the Nanyang Technological University. Thereafter, about 2001, I was made permanent at King's, and I progressed up the career ladder. I became a professor in 2007. Deputy head of the Department of War Studies in 2013, and head of department in between 2016 and 2019. And so, yeah, and I'm a specialist. Principally, I'm a strategic theorist, and I specialize in violent non-state actors. That's been my principal area in which I've written and published. But also, I have many kind of interests where I try to apply strategic thinking. I have a keen interest in the politics and security of Asia and Southeast Asia. I have an interest in the impact of war on the environment, and particularly on animals. And so I have quite a lot of sort of varied interests, but that's roughly the journey which has brought me here.
That's great. That's a great journey. Now, what do you wanna proceed with the questions, Michael?
Yeah. My first question. Well, sorry that I just okay. Well, you said that just you studied also in the Far East. So my question is related to as you are an expert in also in China, and also you wrote about your recent book about its China and the strategic studies of China and its security. I mean, my question is related to the teaching and the use of classics, war and strategy in the universities of the Far East. How are the stuff? Is there any difference in the methodology and in the contents also with the Western counterparts?
Right. Well, I would start by answering that question just with a qualification that I'm. You know, it's been a long time since I have taught in Asia. And indeed, I have actually taught the classics of strategy in Asia, and that was particularly in my first job when I was teaching history at the National University of Singapore. And that is my principal knowledge of the sort of question that you're asking me. To that extent, it would be perhaps wrong of me to sort of generalize too much about how in quotes of the classics are taught in the Asian context, because of course, you know, Asia itself is a very, very large and amorphous idea. All I'd say is that from my own experience, that there is a keen interest to understand what the classics, both the sort of let's say you know, if you use the general idea of the ancient Chinese masters of strategy, you know, Sun Tzu being, of course, the most notable. They are keen to sort of study and to appreciate the teachings of these classic thinkers, and that also applies, I think, to the sort of so-called sort of classics of what we loosely call sort of maybe Western strategic thinking. So, you know, you're thinking your sort of Machiavellians and your Karl von Clausewitzes and so on and so forth. So there is a keenness to understand these thinkers. I think in terms of the, let's say, the classic strategic thinkers, I mean, these of ancient the ancient Chinese tradition, you know, in the context in which I taught strategy in that part of the world, they were you know, that is students, and I think the broader kind of policy making sort of community there is sort of very, how do I call it? They're very keen to inculcate or to sort of let those ideas of what, you know, people like Sun Tzu, you know, what their teachings are. They're very keen to absorb those ideas, if not in a sort of an overt way, but they seem to be sort of reflections of that kind of tradition, which sees politics and political conduct as a very long-term, goal-orientated exercise. So they put a lot of effort, and you can certainly see this in things like, you know, I think certainly modern modern China's political conduct and the way that it seeks to think about its place in the world. It's based on a very sort of longer term sort of working out of where it wants to be, and it thinks quite clearly. The bureaucracy seems to think quite clearly, or at least very systematically, about how it can engage with the international system, various bodies within that, and seek to sort of use the political instruments at its disposal to get its way in the world, and over a longer term sort of basis as well. So if we're talking about kind of China seeing its place as a major player in the international system, in some ways wanting to perhaps displace the United States at some point as the major power in the international system, then I think we can discern that it takes it, that sort of idea, and it thinks and plans very, very carefully about, right from the beginning. You can perhaps go back all the way. I would say, if you want to take a sort of a reasonably sort of long view of this, you can go back certainly to the end of the Maoist period, when that came to an end in the late 1970s, and you had the rise of Deng Xiaoping, who had a very keen understanding of how China should begin to change in order to eventually assert its power in the world, and that began with economics. And then it slowly, and the changing China's economic system to a position where you see now where China is actually rising to a position of some sort of arguably sort of dominance in the economic sphere, and ergo the sort of its associated capabilities, military, political, diplomatic, to actually dominate other spheres of the global system. And so I think that is based itself, without over determining or over reading, the influence of the Chinese classics. You can certainly see Chinese contemporary, Chinese state political conduct very much reflecting that sort of longer term, careful tradition,
right.
Trying to know your enemy, enemies, or know your adversaries, trying to sort of probe their weaknesses, often trying to disguise your intent about what you want to do. You don't, if you want to achieve dominance, you don't make it obvious that you wanted to achieve it. And indeed, that was one of Deng Xiaoping's sort of things that he sort of thought about, was that you actually don't obviously make it look as though you wanted to dominate the whole system, because that will merely generate further adversaries. So I think you can see those sorts of long-term workings out. So that's a very long answer to your question, but I hope that gives you perhaps just a sense of how I think that the so-called classics are reflected in China. And also, just to round off that, there is a debate, for example, about how much the Western classics themselves have influenced certainly modern Chinese leaders. So, for example, Mao Zedong was thought to be, and I think with some good reason, to be sort of very much influenced, or at least certainly had read and had taken on board the thinking of some of the classics, particularly Karl von Clausewitz, the Prussian philosopher of war. So so hopefully I think that can
that pretty much answered. Actually, that answered also probably our next question, the third question. So because it was like kind of related to that. So we might go as well, Marco, if you agree, with for the fourth and fifth question together, which is kind of related to the current situation of the post-COVID-19, the COVID-19, and the post-COVID-19 and the cyber warfare. Marco, you want to go with the question?
Yeah, the fourth question was about how classic authors such as Thucydides, Machiavelli, or Karl von Clausewitz can help to understand the post-COVID-19 international order. I mean, my question is just because I I read your work about the year of the bat. So at the end, I think you also it's just that you want to make a revamp of these classic authors. So my question is how the study of these authors can help to understand the future of the international order.
Sure. Again, it's another very good question, and thank you for reading Year of the Bat. That's very, very nice of you, as always. I'm always grateful when people do take the time to read anything that I've written, so that's appreciated. I think to answer that question, we need to perhaps address first of all what the post-COVID-19 international order is or might look like, or seems to be shaping up as. And I think the way that I certainly evaluated the situation in that co-written publication, Year of the Bat, is that we are witnessing, as a result of not just COVID-19, but I think a lot of sort of political forces that were building up to that, but which COVID-19 has.
Yes, because you talk about the globalization.
Exactly. So I think COVID-19 has largely, I think, spelled the end of what we can perhaps loosely define as an era of globalization. And I can explain what globalization is for your listeners if they would like, but broadly speaking, the transformation in the international system wrought by information and communications technology, and particularly the political interpretation that was put on that as somehow remaking the world in a single in a single direction, that we were all sort of embarked on this sort of path to kind of global citizenship. I mean, I think that era has quite clearly come to an end. So to state the obvious, we have seen during the pandemic the reimposition of very severe border controls. We've seen the end of free movement of people and of labour to a substantial degree. We have seen sort of great suspicion, I think ostensibly quite justified, of the role of China in communist China in the international system. People have realised that China is not necessarily the good global citizen that I think globalists thought that it would become when it was admitted into the World Trade Organization in 2002. And so people are looking to really reinforce the idea of the state as the principal actor in the international system, again, through the reimposition of very stringent border controls to control the movement, particularly of people, but also a more sceptical outlook towards unmitigated free trade. The whole idea that if you do allow all of your industries to be outsourced to sort of China or wherever it might be, that's in itself is not necessarily a good thing. And so I think you're seeing the emergence of industrial strategies, which aim to perhaps repatriate industrial capacity, certainly sort of medical capacities to back to certainly to North America and to Europe and so on. So that seems to be the contours of the global order wrought by the COVID-19 crisis. As I say, and as you rightly kind of intimate, I think globalization was already coming under question prior to that in all sorts of ways. But I think the COVID-19, the response to COVID-19 has simply exacerbated those trends. As for your question about how this perhaps suggests the relevance of some of the kind of the classic political strategic thinkers, I think your sort of Thucydides, Machiavelli, Clausewitz. I think these, the reason why we we, that is to say, you know, people like you and I, scholars and people who think about these things, why we see these people as classical thinkers is because their thinking is seen to be timeless. It speaks to timeless truths of politics and political conduct. And so if you think about Thucydides, who I don't know sort of, you know, very well, but, you know, perhaps I know enough about him to see that his, you know, his sort of ideas about the world being really comprised of, you know, of different kinds of states, strong states, you know, medium-sized power states, and of course smaller states, which means that states in this international system, they have to be realistic about how they can achieve their interests in the world of competing sovereign nations, each out to sort of gain its own interests, and that this involves all sorts of balances of interests and trade-offs. And right. I think that's what you can certainly sort of suggest from Thucydides. Machiavelli is obviously going to be someone who retains the sort of timelessness of their thinking. That you know, his views of which I know is a bit of a caricature, but you know, his views of politics being essentially, you know, a rather dirty business, and you have to behave. You know, it looks, you know, it's you know, one of the things that you might want to do is you have to behave as if you are virtuous, even if your intentions are not. Right. But you need to do that in order to protect your interests. And you need to do that intelligently. You need to make it look as though you are perhaps being, you know, doing good, but actually you might be just crudely attempting to, you know, just gain advantage. But that is politics for you. That's what right. in politics, both domestic and international, is. It's the you know, it's quite often it's the disguising of crude motives with virtuous rhetoric, and I think that's something that we can always take from Machiavelli. And I know it might not seem a particularly admirable way of conducting oneself, but that is the reality of what a lot of right. political life is. Right. And Clausewitz, and I'll finish on this point here. I think I always see him as being sort of very relevant for us when he, for us, I mean people, you know, who think about policy. He calls on us to think about politics and how we should keep our political conduct proportional, you know, how we should think about our goals and how we should think about the means by which we can achieve our goals in a world of you know, competing adversarial interests. And so right. I would suggest that all of those classical thinkers are highly relevant to our current political condition.
Right. Yeah, so now thank you for the whole, you know, for the whole interview, but I would like to finish this where Marco and I have come up together with this question because we wanted to finish this in a more personal way, you know. So we come up with the next question, which would be it's a twofold question, because we would like to know your opinion about the personal opinion of Michael Rainsborough. You know, you got to put yourself in the feet of Machiavelli and of Thucydides, you know, and all those great strategies. And the question would be like, which would be the keys for peace and for war for you? If Michael Rainsborough would write a book about peace and war, and who would be a Machiavelli of our age, you know, what would you say? You know, what would you write on that book? What is the key for war, and what is the key for peace?
So the easy questions to last, haven't you?
I'm sorry.
Yeah, no, so well. That's a really great question, and of course it's obviously invites an extremely broad answer, which probably I can't do justice to in a few minutes, but let me try.
Right.
I think in terms of what I think the keys to war and peace are, and I would perhaps sort of, you know, give you maybe 6 or 7 kind of key things to think about. First of all, I think one of the central or the keys is to think clearly about what your objectives are, when you're considering any form of political conduct, or sometimes even personal conduct. I think it's always to be very clear about what specifically you want to get out of a particular situation, and what does it look like when you have achieved your goals. And I say that because if you have a good picture of what success looks like, you will know when to stop.
Right.
And knowing when to stop is one of the keys to,
right.
I think, to being a good strategist. Secondly, I think in order to have a good understanding of that first question, you must also ask yourself, what are the key values and ideas that you wish to advance or to protect? And politics and or thinking about your own role in the world is really all about value systems. It's about what interests, what sort of guiding sort of passions or virtues really are meaningful to you. What do you want to do to sort of advance or protect those? Thirdly, and again, it follows on from the other point, is what actual sacrifices are you, the policymaker or the person in question, what sacrifices, human, economic or social, are you willing to put in to defend those particular values? Fourthly, and again, this particularly applies to sort of policy elites, so-called policy experts, is that I think you must have a good understanding of your own society. What does what does your population actually, what kind of, and I know it's a very broad point, but what is the general kind of disposition and the temper of your population? What are the broad kind of ideas that it has of itself, that it the values that it wishes to uphold, because that governs your understanding of how far you can push a particular society to engage in sacrifices for the defense of particular goals or values. And I think one of the problems that certainly Western foreign policy has had in the recent past is that it has devolved its foreign policy thinking to a set of self-invoked sort of so-called experts who are really quite detached from their own societies, and they end up sort of seeing and they end up advocating, I think, pretty reckless foreign policy interventions in particular, which, as we know, haven't worked out very well, but which, if we had really understood the temper of our populations, we probably would have done things very differently. But I think that's another key understanding. And I think the whole issue of proportionality, I think, is always a key requirement to understand whether you are being strategically effective, and that is this balancing out of costs and benefit. And I know that seems a fairly obvious point to make, but you'd be surprised at how little policymakers tend to take note of that particular sort of idea. And finally, again, if we're talking about states, the conduct of states and policymakers and policymaking, I would suggest that, and this is not just Michael Rainsborough's reading of the world. Here I am. I'm a self-invoked expert. So I would say, look. If you read the classics, if you read Machiavelli or Thucydides and Clausewitz, and you have a historical disposition to reflect on the course of history in terms of the politics of the international system, then I think one of the lessons is, and it flows on from what I've just said, I think, in the other points, and that is that we states, particularly Western states, should dispense with what I would call ethicist foreign policies, so-called progressive foreign policies trying to make the world a better place, for the simple reason that your idea or our idea of what a better world looks like is not necessarily someone else's.